My ex-wife's new boyfriend poisoned my service dog because he thought I was faking PTSD for attention. When I exposed him 3 years later, he lost everything while I became the most successful dog trainer in the state. I'm 35 matters and served 2 tours in Afghanistan before getting medically discharged in 2015. The IED that took out our convoy left me with a traumatic brain injury and severe PTSD that made civilian life nearly impossible. The VA paired me with Ranger, a German Shepherd who literally saved my life every single day. Ranger wasn't just a pet, he was medical equipment. He could sense my panic attacks before they started interrupt nightmares by waking me up and create space between me and crowds when I got overwhelmed. Without him, I couldn't leave my apartment, couldn't work, couldn't function as a human being. When I met Ashley in 2018 at a coffee shop near the VA hospital, I thought I'd found someone who understood. She was a nurse who worked with trauma patients and seemed genuinely interested in learning about service dogs and how they helped veterans. We dated for 8 months before I moved in with her. The problem started when Ashley began dating her coworker Brad while we were still together. I discovered the affair through text messages on her phone, but when I confronted her, she turned it around on me, said I was too damaged to be in a real relationship and that she needed someone stable and normal. Brad made his opinion of me clear from the beginning. He worked in hospital administration and thought veterans were either heroes to be pitied or frauds looking for handouts. Since I didn't fit his hero narrative, I must be faking my disabilities for attention and benefits. The divorce was messy. Ashley tried to claim half my disability payments and wanted me to pay alimony despite her affair. She even suggested that Ranger should be sold and the money split between us since he was technically property. My lawyer shut that down quickly, but it showed how little she understood about service animals. After the divorce, I moved into a small apartment across town and tried to rebuild my life. Ranger and I had our routine: morning training sessions at the local park, afternoon visits to veteran support groups, evening walks around the neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was peaceful. That peace ended when Brad started showing up everywhere I went. He'd be at the coffee shop when I arrived for my weekly therapy appointment, at the grocery store when I was shopping, at the park during Ranger's training time, always watching, always sneering, like he was waiting for me to prove his theory about fake veterans. The harassment escalated over months. Brad would follow close behind us during walks, talking loudly on his phone about welfare queens and disability fraud. He'd film me with Ranger claiming he was gathering evidence of misuse of government resources. Once he even called the police, claiming I had an aggressive dog in a no-pets area. Every incident was designed to trigger my PTSD and prove I was unstable. The constant surveillance and confrontation sent my anxiety through the roof. Even Ranger seemed stressed by Brad's presence, performing his alert behaviors more frequently and staying hypervigilant during our outings. The final incident happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I was at the VA hospital for my monthly psychiatric evaluation when Brad appeared in the parking lot. He must have followed me from my apartment 20 minutes away. This time he brought a woman with a clipboard who introduced herself as an investigator. Brad told her I was fraudulently using a fake service dog to gain access to restricted areas, that he'd documented multiple instances of the dog being out of control and not performing any actual tasks. The investigator seemed skeptical, but agreed to observe Ranger's behavior and ask questions about his training. For 30 minutes, I had to prove my dog's legitimacy to a stranger, while Brad smirked in the background. Ranger performed perfectly, demonstrating his alert response when I started getting anxious from the situation. The investigator concluded that Ranger was clearly a legitimate service animal and warned Brad about harassment, but Brad wasn't done. 2 days later, I came home from group therapy to find my apartment door open and Ranger missing. No signs of forced entry, which meant someone had used a key. I called Ashley immediately since she still had an emergency key from when we lived together. She claimed she'd given the key to Brad weeks ago so he could check on the apartment while I was getting treatment. Said she was worried about my mental state and thought someone should keep an eye on me. The betrayal hit harder than discovering their affair had. I spent 6 hours searching the neighborhood, calling shelters and posting on social media. Around midnight, I got a call from an emergency vet clinic 15 miles away. Someone had brought in a German Shepherd suffering from antifreeze poisoning. The dog was in critical condition. Racing to the clinic, I found Ranger unconscious, hooked up to IV fluids and dialysis equipment. The vet explained that antifreeze poisoning was often fatal and that Ranger's kidneys were shutting down. They were doing everything possible, but the prognosis was grim. I sat with Ranger all night, holding his paw and talking to him while machines kept him alive. The vet tech mentioned that whoever brought him in claimed to have found him collapsed in their yard. They left contact information, but when I called the number, it was disconnected. Ranger died at 6:47 a.m. on March 15th. I was holding his head when he stopped breathing. The vet said his suffering was over, but mine was just beginning. Without Ranger, I couldn't function, couldn't leave my apartment, couldn't even answer the phone when the VA called to check on me. The funeral home that specialized in pet services helped me arrange a cremation. Other veterans from my support group attended the service and shared stories about how Ranger had helped them too during group sessions, but nothing could fill the emptiness he left behind. For 2 weeks, I barely left my apartment. The panic attacks returned with full force now that I had no early warning system. Nightmares interrupted my sleep every night without Ranger there to wake me. Simple tasks like grocery shopping became impossible when crowds triggered my fight or flight response. That's when Marcus, my buddy from the Marines, called to check on me. He'd heard about Ranger through the veteran network and drove 3 hours to my apartment. Finding me in pajamas eating cereal for dinner, he knew intervention was needed immediately. Marcus helped me contact the VA about emergency mental health services and getting approval for another service dog. But the waiting list was 18 months and required extensive paperwork proving my current dog was deceased. The bureaucracy was overwhelming when I could barely function normally. While dealing with VA paperwork, I started investigating Ranger's death. The emergency vet provided the contact information for the person who brought him in. It was a fake name and phone number, but they had security cameras in their parking lot. The footage showed Brad's car pulling up at 11:47 p.m. He carried Ranger's unconscious body from his trunk to the clinic entrance, then drove away without going inside. Someone else brought Ranger in 15 minutes later, after Brad called them claiming to have found a sick dog. I took the footage to police, but they said poisoning cases were hard to prove without witnesses. Brad claimed he'd found Ranger collapsed near a construction site where antifreeze spills were common. Without evidence of him administering the poison, they couldn't file charges. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ashley called me 3 weeks after Ranger's death. She was crying and said Brad had been acting strange since that night, talking in his sleep about feeling guilty, making comments about hoping I'd learned my lesson. During one of Brad's sleep-talking episodes, Ashley recorded him on her phone. The audio was muffled, but clearly captured him saying he'd put the antifreeze in hamburger meat and watched Ranger eat it, that he'd waited until I was at therapy to break into my apartment with Ashley's key. Ashley was horrified when she realized what the recording revealed. She'd suspected Brad disliked me, but never imagined he'd actually murder my service dog. She agreed to give me the recording and testify about Brad's strange behavior if needed. Armed with the security footage and Ashley's recording, I went back to police. This time they took the case seriously and arrested Brad for animal cruelty and breaking and entering. The local news covered the story, and suddenly everyone knew what had happened to my service dog. The community response was overwhelming. Other veterans shared their own stories of harassment for using service animals. Local businesses banned Brad from their premises. His employer, the regional hospital system, launched an internal investigation into his conduct. Brad's lawyer tried to claim the recording was inadmissible because Ashley made it without consent. But Colorado is a one-party consent state, meaning she was legally allowed to record conversations she was part of, even while Brad was unconscious. The evidence held up in court. During the trial, more details emerged about Brad's systematic harassment campaign. Security cameras at multiple locations had captured him following me around town. His search history showed research into service dog regulations and ways to discredit PTSD claims. Most damaging was testimony from his co-workers at the hospital. Several nurses reported that Brad had made inappropriate comments about veterans and disability fraud. He'd specifically mentioned wanting to prove that psychological service dogs were scams and their handlers were just seeking attention. The prosecutor painted a picture of a man obsessed with discrediting a veteran's legitimate need for medical equipment. The premeditated nature of the crime, planning the break and researching antifreeze poisoning and creating alibis, showed this wasn't impulsive but calculated cruelty. Brad was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 2 years in prison, plus restitution for Ranger's medical bills and my therapy costs. But the legal victory felt hollow because Ranger was still gone and my daily struggles continued without him. The media attention from the trial had an unexpected side effect. Dog trainers from around the state reached out offering to help me get a new service dog. One trainer, Sarah, who specialized in PTSD animals, offered to work with me personally to train a replacement. Sarah had a 6-month-old German Shepherd named Ace, who'd been selected for service training, but hadn't been matched with a handler yet. She thought his temperament and my experience with Ranger would make a good combination. Training would take months, but Ace could live with me during the process. Meeting Ace for the first time was emotional. He looked similar to Ranger, but had his own personality and energy. Sarah explained that every service dog partnership is unique, and that I shouldn't expect Ace to be a replacement for Ranger, but rather a new beginning. Training Ace became my full-time focus. Sarah taught me professional techniques for developing service dog behaviors, while Ace learned to read my specific needs and triggers. The process was therapeutic for both of us as we built trust and communication. 6 months later, Ace graduated as a fully trained psychiatric service dog. He could perform all of Ranger's tasks, plus several new ones Sarah had developed specifically for my needs. Having a working service dog again transformed my ability to function in daily life. But something else had changed during those months of training. Working with Sarah, I discovered a natural talent for understanding canine behavior and communication. She suggested I consider becoming a professional dog trainer myself, specializing in service animals for veterans. The idea seemed impossible at first. I had no formal education in animal behavior, and my PTSD still affected my ability to handle stressful situations. But Sarah offered to mentor me through certification programs and help me build the skills needed for professional training. Starting the certification process while dealing with PTSD was challenging, but Sarah made it manageable. She broke down complex concepts into smaller pieces and allowed me to work at my own pace. ACE provided emotional support during studying and helped me stay calm during practical exams. The first certification was in basic dog obedience, which I passed easily thanks to my experience with Ranger and months training ACE. But Sarah pushed me toward more specialized programs, focusing on psychiatric service dogs and trauma recovery animals. These certifications were more demanding and expensive, but opened doors to working with veterans. 9 months after starting the program, I earned my first professional certification as a canine behavior specialist. Sarah immediately offered me part-time work at her training facility, helping with intake assessments and basic obedience classes. The pay wasn't much, but it was my first income since leaving the military. Working with dogs again gave me purpose beyond just managing my own symptoms. Each animal had unique challenges, and learning their individual personalities reminded me why I'd connected so strongly with Ranger. The work was therapeutic in ways traditional counseling hadn't achieved. My breakthrough case came 6 months later when the VA referred a Marine named Tommy who'd been struggling to bond with his new service dog. The dog was well trained, but Tommy couldn't trust the animal after losing his previous partner in a car accident. Traditional trainers hadn't been able to help him move past the grief. Understanding Tommy's trauma from personal experience, I approached the training differently. Instead of focusing on commands and behaviors, we worked on rebuilding trust between human and animal. I shared my own story about losing Ranger and finding healing with ACE. The connection was immediate. Tommy's progress was remarkable. Within weeks, he and his dog were working as a team again. His wife called Sarah to thank her for recommending me, saying it was the first time Tommy had seemed hopeful since his accident. Word spread through the veteran community about my unconventional but effective methods. More referrals followed. Veterans who'd been failed by traditional training programs found success with my trauma-informed approach. I understood their hesitation, their grief, their fear in ways that civilian trainers couldn't. My military background and experience with service dogs gave me credibility they trusted. Sarah encouraged me to pursue advanced certifications in animal-assisted therapy and PTSD treatment. These programs were intense, requiring coursework in psychology, trauma theory, and specialized training techniques. But they would allow me to work directly with medical professionals and expand my client base. The advanced training took 18 months, but opened entirely new opportunities. Hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and therapy practices began requesting my services for their patients with PTSD, anxiety, and depression. My client base expanded beyond veterans to include accident survivors, abuse victims, and people with various mental health conditions. 2 years after Brad's conviction, I opened my own training facility with Sarah as a business partner. We specialized in psychiatric service dogs, therapy animals, and rehabilitation training for traumatized pets. The facility included indoor and outdoor training areas, boarding kennels, and office space for consultations. The business grew rapidly through word-of-mouth referrals. Veterans Affairs contracted with us to provide training services for newly paired service dog teams. Local hospitals requested our therapy animals for patient visits. Even law enforcement agencies hired us to work with canine units dealing with stress and trauma. My reputation in the veteran community continued to expand. I spoke at VA hospitals about service dog partnerships and testified before state legislators about protecting service animal rights. Media outlets featured stories about my journey from victim to successful business owner. The financial success was beyond anything I'd imagined possible. Within 3 years, our facility was generating over $500,000 annually. I owned a house with acreage for training, expanded the business to include breeding programs, and employed 12 full-time staff members. But the real satisfaction came from the animals and people we helped. Every successful service dog partnership, every veteran who regained independence, every therapy animal that brought comfort to hospital patients validated the path I'd chosen after losing Ranger. Meanwhile, Brad's life took the opposite trajectory. Prison was harder on him than expected. Other inmates didn't look kindly on someone who'd tortured animals, especially a veteran's service dog. He spent most of his sentence in protective custody, which meant isolation and limited privileges. When Brad was released after 18 months, he found his world completely changed. The hospital had terminated his employment during his conviction, and his professional reputation made finding new work impossible. Healthcare administration is a small field, and everyone knew about the veteran's service dog case. Ashley had divorced him while he was incarcerated, unable to handle the shame and harassment from the community. She'd also provided additional evidence to prosecutors, including Brad's research into ways to harm service animals and his obsessive documentation of my daily routines. Brad's attempts to rebuild his life were consistently undermined by his criminal record. Background checks revealed the animal cruelty conviction, making him unemployable in healthcare or any field requiring trust and responsibility. He eventually found work in manual labor, earning a fraction of his previous salary. The financial restitution order followed him everywhere. My therapy costs, veterinary bills for Ranger, and compensation for emotional distress totaled over $40,000. Wage garnishment took a significant portion of his meager income, ensuring he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. More damaging than financial problems was the social isolation. Brad's crime had made him a pariah in our mid-sized community. Former friends and colleagues avoided him, family members distanced themselves, and neighbors who knew his story treated him with disgust and suspicion. His attempts to rebuild relationships were hampered by his complete lack of remorse. In interviews with parole officers and court-appointed counselors, Brad consistently blamed me for causing his problems. He claimed I'd manipulated the legal system and turned people against him unfairly. This attitude prevented him from accessing rehabilitation programs or support services that might have helped his reintegration. Counselors noted his narcissistic tendencies and inability to accept responsibility for his actions. Without genuine remorse, meaningful change was impossible. 3 years after his release, Brad was arrested again, this time for stalking a different veteran with a service dog. Security cameras caught him following the veteran through a shopping mall, taking photos and making phone calls that appeared to be coordinating with others. The pattern was identical to his harassment of me. The new charges violated his parole and resulted in additional prison time. But more importantly, they established a pattern of targeting disabled veterans, which elevated the crimes to federal hate crime status. Brad was now facing serious federal charges with much longer potential sentences. The FBI investigation revealed that Brad had been networking with online groups that specifically targeted veterans and disability rights advocates. His computer contained manifestos about exposing fake disabilities and plans for systematically harassing service dog users across multiple states. Federal prosecutors built a case showing Brad was part of a larger conspiracy to intimidate and harm disabled veterans. His attack on Ranger wasn't an isolated incident, but part of an ongoing campaign against people he viewed as fraudulent. The federal charges carried sentences of up to 20 years. During this time, my business continued thriving beyond all expectations. We'd expanded to 3 locations across Colorado and were consulting with facilities in neighboring states. My expertise in trauma-informed animal training was becoming nationally recognized. The success allowed me to give back to the veteran community in meaningful ways. I established a nonprofit foundation that provided free service dogs to veterans who couldn't afford them through traditional channels. The program covered all training costs and ongoing support for the life of the animal. My foundation also funded research into innovative training techniques for PTSD service dogs. Working with veterinary schools and psychology departments, we developed new protocols that improved success rates and reduced training time. These innovations benefited veterans nationwide. Speaking engagements took me across the country, sharing my story at conferences, medical centers, and veteran organizations. Each presentation reached hundreds of people who learned about service dog rights, trauma recovery, and the importance of protecting vulnerable populations from harassment. The contrast between my trajectory and Brad's became a powerful illustration of how choices determine outcomes. While he spiraled deeper into legal troubles and social isolation, I built a successful business, helped thousands of people, and found purpose beyond my own recovery. Television producers approached me about documenting my journey from losing Ranger to building a successful business. The resulting documentary aired on a major network and won awards for its portrayal of veteran issues and animal-assisted therapy. The exposure brought even more clients and opportunities. Book publishers wanted me to write about my experiences with PTSD service dogs and building a business while managing mental health challenges. The autobiography became a bestseller, with proceeds supporting my foundation's work, providing free service dogs to veterans. Universities began inviting me to lecture about entrepreneurship, trauma recovery, and animal behavior. These academic connections led to research collaborations and consulting opportunities with major corporations developing pet products and services. The financial success was remarkable, but the personal growth was even more valuable. Working with traumatized animals and their handlers taught me patience, resilience, and the healing power of purpose. Each successful partnership reminded me that Ranger's death, although tragic, had ultimately led to helping thousands of others. Brad's federal trial made national news when prosecutors revealed the scope of his anti-veteran conspiracy. Evidence showed he'd been coordinating with extremist groups planning attacks on disabled veterans across multiple states. His conviction on terrorism charges resulted in a 25-year federal sentence. The trial testimony revealed disturbing details about Brad's obsession with proving veterans were fraudulent. His apartment contained detailed surveillance files on dozens of disabled veterans, including photos, addresses, and daily routines. Plans for escalating harassment campaigns showed clear intent to cause serious harm. Victim impact statements from veterans he'd targeted painted a picture of systematic psychological warfare designed to strip away the support systems disabled people depended on. My testimony about losing Ranger and the impact on my mental health became a centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The federal conviction also triggered civil lawsuits from Brad's other victims. Veterans across 3 states filed claims for emotional distress harassment and violation of their civil rights. The total damages exceeded $2 million, ensuring Brad would never escape financial responsibility for his actions. Meanwhile, my business achievements achievements continued accumulating recognition. Industry publications named me Entrepreneur of the Year for innovative approaches to animal training. Professional organizations awarded me lifetime achievement honors for advancing the field of psychiatric service animals. The success allowed me to expand internationally, consulting with organizations in Europe and Australia about establishing service dog programs for their veteran populations. These partnerships shared American innovations while learning from different cultural approaches to animal-assisted therapy. My foundation's impact grew exponentially as more donors supported our mission. Corporate sponsors funded training facilities, equipment, and staff salaries, allowing us to serve hundreds of veterans annually. The program's success rate exceeded 90%, with most partnerships lasting the lifetime of the animals. Research collaborations produced breakthrough discoveries about how dogs detect and respond to human psychological states. Our findings influenced training protocols worldwide and contributed to scientific understanding of human-animal bonds in therapeutic contexts. The transformation from broken veteran to industry leader took 7 years, but felt like a lifetime of growth and healing. Every success built upon the foundation Ranger had provided during my darkest period. His death, although devastating, had ultimately saved countless other veterans through the work it inspired. Speaking at veteran hospitals, I often shared how losing Ranger forced me to find strength I didn't know existed. The grief and anger from his murder became fuel for building something meaningful that honored his memory while helping others. Purpose emerged from pain in ways I never could have imagined. The business now employs over 50 people across multiple locations, with annual revenue exceeding $3 million. But more important than financial metrics are the lives changed through our work. Every veteran who regains independence, every therapy animal that provides comfort, validates the path that began with such devastating loss. Brad's story serves as a cautionary tale about how hatred and obsession can destroy a life. His inability to accept responsibility, coupled with escalating criminal behavior, led from comfortable middle-class existence to federal prison and social exile. The contrast with my own journey illustrates how we choose our responses to adversity. 10 years after Ranger's death, I stood before Congress testifying about legislation to strengthen penalties for attacks on service animals. The bill passed unanimously, creating federal protections that would prevent other veterans from experiencing what I had endured. The boy who once followed me around town documenting my every move now spends his days in federal prison, serving a sentence that will likely last until he's elderly. His obsession with proving I was fraudulent ultimately revealed his own criminal nature and led to his permanent removal from society. My story became proof that trauma doesn't have to define us, that purpose can emerge from the darkest experiences, and that healing often comes through helping others. Ranger's legacy lives on through every service dog we train, every veteran we serve, and every life we touch through our work. The most successful dog training business in the state grew from the ashes of a murdered service dog and the determination of a veteran who refused to let hatred win. Brad wanted to prove I was broken, but instead proved that broken people can build something beautiful when they channel their pain into purpose. But my story didn't end with Brad's conviction or even my business success. 3 months after his federal sentencing, I received an unexpected phone call that would test everything I'd learned about forgiveness and moving forward. The caller was Brad's sister Karen, someone I'd never met but who'd been following my story through news coverage of the trial. Her voice was shaky and hesitant as she explained that she'd been estranged from Brad for years due to his increasingly erratic behavior, but felt compelled to reach out. Karen revealed that Brad's hatred of veterans and service dogs stemmed from childhood trauma involving their father, who'd returned from Vietnam with severe PTSD. Their father had struggled with alcohol addiction, violence, and inability to maintain employment, ultimately abandoning the family when Brad was 12. She explained that Brad had developed a twisted belief that veterans who sought help were weak like their father, and that service dogs were crutches preventing people from becoming self-reliant. His attack on Ranger wasn't random, but rooted in deep psychological damage from his own family's trauma. Karen wasn't making excuses for Brad's crimes, but wanted me to understand the context of his actions. She also revealed that Brad had finally begun accepting responsibility for his crimes after months of federal prison therapy. He'd asked her to reach out and inquire whether I'd be willing to participate in a restorative justice program. The request caught me completely off guard. After years of legal battles, media attention, and building my business, I'd assumed my connection to Brad was permanently severed. The idea of voluntarily engaging with him again seemed absurd and potentially harmful to my continued healing. I discussed the request with my therapist, who helped me process the complex emotions it triggered. Anger that Brad thought he deserved my attention after murdering Ranger. Curiosity about whether he genuinely changed or was manipulating the system. Fear that engaging with him might undermine my progress. My therapist explained that restorative justice programs sometimes helped both victims and offenders process trauma and find closure, but participation had to be entirely voluntary and only undertaken when victims felt strong enough to handle potential emotional challenges. There was no obligation to forgive or provide comfort to someone who'd caused such harm. harm. After weeks of consideration, I decided to learn more about the program without committing to participation. The federal prison's restorative justice coordinator explained that Brad had been in intensive therapy for 18 months and had made significant progress in understanding his behavior patterns and accepting responsibility. The coordinator stressed that any meeting would be carefully structured with professional facilitators and security present. The goal wasn't necessarily forgiveness, but rather giving both parties opportunity to express their experiences and potentially find some form of closure or understanding. Meanwhile, my business continued evolving in ways I hadn't anticipated. The documentary about my journey had inspired other veterans with entrepreneurial ideas, and I'd begun mentoring former service members who wanted to start their own businesses. This informal coaching led to establishing a veteran entrepreneur program through my foundation. The program provided business training, startup funding, and ongoing mentorship specifically for veterans who wanted to channel their military skills into civilian enterprises. Our first cohort included a former Navy SEAL starting a security consulting firm, a Marine opening an automotive repair shop, and an Air Force veteran launching a catering business. Watching these veterans transform their own trauma and military experience into successful businesses reminded me of my own journey and reinforced the healing power of purpose-driven work. Each success story validated the model of turning adversity into advantage through focused effort and community support. The Veteran Entrepreneur Program attracted attention from major corporations looking to support military families and from government agencies seeking innovative approaches to veteran employment challenges. Corporate sponsors provided funding, while government contracts offered market opportunities for program graduates. Within 2 years, the program had launched over 50 veteran-owned businesses with a survival rate significantly higher than typical startup statistics. The combination of military discipline, strong community support, and targeted mentorship created ideal conditions for entrepreneurial success. My role evolved from dog trainer to business mentor to national advocate for veteran entrepreneurship. Speaking engagements now focused as much on business development and leadership as on animal training and PTSD recovery. The platform Ranger's death had inadvertently created continued expanding. Universities began developing case studies around my business model and transformation story. Harvard Business School included my journey in their entrepreneurship curriculum, while military academies used my experience to teach cadets about civilian transition planning. The academic attention led to research collaborations studying the connection between military service entrepreneurship and mental health recovery. Our findings suggested that business ownership provided many veterans with sense of purpose and community that traditional employment couldn't match. These research projects attracted federal funding for expanding veteran entrepreneur programs nationwide. The Small Business Administration partnered with my foundation to create training modules that could be replicated in communities across the country. My personal story became blueprint for systematic change. 5 years after Brad's conviction, I finally agreed to participate in the restorative justice meeting. My decision wasn't motivated by forgiveness or sympathy, but by curiosity about whether genuine change was possible and whether the experience might provide additional closure. The meeting took place in a secure conference room at the federal prison with trained facilitators and security personnel present. Brad looked dramatically different from the confident hospital administrator who'd once harassed me. Prison and therapy had aged him considerably, and his demeanor was subdued, almost fragile. The facilitator explained the ground rules, emphasizing that both parties could end the session at any time, and that the goal was mutual understanding rather than reconciliation. Brad would speak first, sharing his perspective and accepting responsibility. Then I would have opportunity to respond. Brad's statement was longer and more detailed than I'd expected. He spoke about his childhood trauma, his father's struggles with PTSD, and how he'd developed twisted beliefs about veterans seeking help. He acknowledged that attacking Ranger was unconscionable, and that his subsequent crimes revealed deep psychological problems he'd refused to address. He described the therapy he'd undergone in prison, including intensive work on understanding his behavior patterns and developing empathy for his victims. He'd learned about the actual challenges veterans face and the legitimate medical necessity of service animals. His ignorance and prejudice had been confronted systematically. Most importantly, Brad acknowledged that his actions weren't isolated mistakes, but part of a pattern of targeting vulnerable people to make himself feel superior. He recognized that his crimes had caused immeasurable harm, not just to me, but to other veterans and their families. When it was my turn to speak, I shared the impact of Ranger's death on my daily life and recovery process. I described the panic attacks, nightmares, and inability to function that had returned after losing my service dog. I explained how his harassment had made simple activities like grocery shopping feel dangerous and overwhelming. I also shared how his crimes had inadvertently led to positive changes in my life, including discovering my talent for dog training, building a successful business, and helping thousands of other veterans. While I couldn't thank him for murdering Ranger, I could acknowledge that my response to his actions had created something meaningful. The most important thing I wanted Brad to understand was the ripple effect of his crimes. Every veteran who now now had a service dog through my foundation, every person whose life was touched by our therapy animals, every piece of legislation protecting service animals existed partly because of what he'd done to Ranger. Brad listened without interrupting, occasionally wiping tears from his eyes. When I finished, he thanked me for participating and acknowledged that facing his victims was part of accepting responsibility for his actions. He didn't ask for forgiveness or try to minimize his crimes. The facilitator asked if either of us had questions for the other. I asked Brad whether he truly understood why veterans needed service dogs or if he still harbored resentment about disability benefits. His answer revealed genuine learning about PTSD trauma and the legitimate medical role of psychiatric service animals. Brad asked whether I thought people could truly change or if some actions were unforgivable. I told him that change was possible but required sustained effort over years, not months. That while I could acknowledge his progress, I would never forget what he'd done to Ranger or trust him around vulnerable people. The session lasted 3 hours and ended without dramatic reconciliation or forgiveness, but it provided closure I hadn't realized I needed. Seeing Brad face the consequences of his actions and genuinely grapple with the harm he'd caused validated my decision to seek justice rather than simply moving on. Driving home from the prison, I felt lighter somehow, not because I'd forgiven Brad, but because I'd seen that accountability and consequences could lead to genuine self-reflection and change. The man who'd murdered Ranger was still in prison, but he was no longer the same person who'd committed that crime. My therapist helped me process the experience over several sessions. The meeting hadn't healed old wounds, but had provided evidence that justice systems could sometimes facilitate genuine rehabilitation. Brad's transformation didn't excuse his crimes, but showed that even destructive people could potentially change. The restorative justice experience influenced my approach to working with troubled veterans in my programs. Understanding that behavior often stemmed from unprocessed trauma helped me develop more effective interventions for clients struggling with anger, aggression, or self-destructive patterns. This perspective proved valuable when working with veterans whose service dogs were struggling with behavioral issues, often stemming from their handler's unresolved trauma. Addressing the human side of the partnership frequently resolved problems that traditional training couldn't fix. My business model evolved to include trauma-informed therapy alongside traditional dog training. Licensed counselors joined our staff to work with veterans who needed mental health support in addition to service dog training. The integrated approach improved outcomes significantly. The success of this model attracted attention from Veterans Affairs, which contracted with us to provide comprehensive services at VA medical centers nationwide. Our approach became the gold standard for service dog programs, combining animal training with mental health treatment. 10 years after losing Ranger, my foundation had provided over 2,000 service dogs to veterans across all 50 states. The ripple effects of one murdered dog had created a movement that transformed thousands of lives and influenced policy at the highest levels of government. Brad remained in federal prison, serving his 25-year sentence for terrorism-related charges. Karen provided occasional updates about his continued participation in rehabilitation programs and his work helping other inmates with substance abuse issues. His transformation appeared genuine, but didn't change the fact that his actions had consequences lasting decades. The contrast between our paths illustrated fundamental truths about how people respond to adversity. While Brad had channeled his childhood trauma into hatred and violence, I'd transformed my grief into purpose and service. The difference wasn't our circumstances, but our choices about how to handle pain. Speaking at the 10-year memorial service for Ranger, I shared these reflections with an audience of veterans' families and supporters. Ranger's grave marker had become a pilgrimage site for people whose lives had been touched by our work. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, left by grateful families and fellow veterans. The memorial garden surrounding Ranger's grave now included markers for dozens of other service dogs who'd passed away after lives of service to their veteran partners. Each marker told a story of sacrifice, love, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals trained to heal rather than harm. Standing among those markers, I reflected on the journey that began with such devastating loss. Ranger's murder had felt like the end of everything important in my life. Instead, it became the beginning of a mission that honored his memory by ensuring other veterans never experienced similar loss. The boy who'd wanted to prove I was broken had instead proven that broken people could become builders of hope. My success wasn't measured only in dollars earned or dogs trained, but in lives saved, relationships restored, and futures made possible through the healing power of human-animal partnerships. Brad's story served as a reminder that hatred destroys the hater more than the target. His obsession with discrediting my disability had ultimately revealed his own moral disability and led to his permanent removal from society. Meanwhile, the veteran he'd tried to destroy had become a nationally recognized leader and advocate. Ranger's legacy extended far beyond the dogs we'd trained or the business we'd built. Every piece of legislation protecting service animals, every veteran who found healing through animal partnerships, every child who learned compassion by watching therapy dogs work, carried forward the love that one German Shepherd had had embodied. The most successful dog training business in the state had grown into a national movement for veteran empowerment and animal-assisted healing, but success was measured not in revenue or recognition, but in the simple truth that Ranger's death had ultimately saved thousands of lives and prevented countless other tragedies.